So this is I am going to go on and talk about Unpath'd Waters in particular, which is a fairly recent project which wrapped up in November 24. But I just want to give a little bit of background context so that people kind of understand why we ended up doing what we did in Unpath'd Waters and the lessons learned. So I'm going to go back and have a little look at some earlier projects and the approaches that we've taken using specifically immersive systems. Having said that, if I can click this forward, there we go, excellent. So there's a kind of overarching structure, there's an overarching development in digital heritage visualization over the last few years. And this is where we've gone from using data acquisition technologies to record objects in 3 dimensions. So basically we're simply creating records in digital formats of the material. Over time, we've come to realize that these records, in fact, are artifacts in themselves. The process of replication allows an extension of the biography across these digital boundaries, and it's wrapped up in work, some of which I'll show you, looking at creative response, but specifically looking at co-design and co-production with community groups. And how that changes the nature of the record to make it an artifact, a thing in itself. For the Unpath'd Waters project, we're actually more interested in this later development, where digital contents move from a record to an artifact, and then we start to fully take advantage of the affordances that the digital can actually offer us. So one of the things that digital media of all kinds do particularly well is allow for linking between different forms of records through the internet, and it's exactly the same with immersive systems. They should allow you to do these things. So we're looking at a translation from a record of an original becomes an artifact in its own right with its own affordances, and ultimately that becomes a portal into broader and richer stories, really taking advantage of the affordances of the digital domain. Just so we know what we're kind of talking about, the digital records can be tiny. There's a glass bead done by an ex-PhD student of mine. Then we have these medium-sized content. This is digital co-production taking place on a Bronze Age standing stone, which is with the later early Christian additions to it. And I've been a big advocate and worked a lot in projects that are specifically designed to work with the communities whose heritage we're dealing with, using these digital tools. So actually using the new tools for data acquisition and for digital production. So it's not trying to avoid the scenario where it's a group of experts interacting with a community, telling them what their heritage is, telling them why it matters, deploying digital technologies, and then going away again. This is really about engaging with the community in the production of the digital content itself, and that's part of the process that allows the digital record to be translated into a kind of meaningful artifact stroke object with associations in its own right as part of that process. In terms of creative response in immersive systems, this is I'm just going to run this a little bit. This is work. This is a student's work done with data acquired on the Isle of Staffa. We've been very interested in, particularly around the Isle of Staffa, in engaging in creative response to these sites, and not least because over the last 200 years you have had Turner and Mendelssohn and endless writers and poets responding to places like the Isle of Staffa, and it seems strange to me that we would engage in recording and representing that site without without making ourselves part of that continuum of creative response. Moving on to another type of recording. So some of you may recognize this. This is actually a laser scan composite of a number of laser scans undertaken in the inside of the Mackintosh building, which was obviously with Glasgow Arts, one of its most famous buildings. And this laser scan took place after a fire in 2014. And it was used as the basis for a building information modeling, or HBIM system, that was developed by Page Park and others, for the reconstruction of the Mackintosh building. And the reason I'm mentioning this now, I'm throwing this in, is that the idea through HBIM that you essentially have a back-end database with a 3D interface is not new. So linking three-dimensional models with rich back-end, in the case of BIM, of course, it tends to be parametric data associated with building and reconstruction, but it's a database and it could essentially hold anything. Tragically, before that reconstruction could take place, there was another fire, a much more catastrophic fire in 2018. But we had laser scans of the interior, and as part of what was actually meant to be the reopening process before the second fire, we decided that we could use some of the content from this laser scan. So this is a laser scan of the interior of the building after the 2014 fire, when a number of the plaster casts which had been used in the art school's drawing collection had been put in here for storage, in essence. And we can see right in the middle at the back, the man who looks like he's in pain. Unfortunately, you can't see. That's Laocoon. The Laocoon and his son, very, very famous marble statue discovered in the 1500s. It's actually a copy of a Hellenic bronze, which is lost. The Laocoon tells a very, very interesting story about multiple phases, multiple episodes of transmateriality from the notion of what was presumably an oral history around Laocoon, a Trojan priest, becomes a bronze sculpture, then becomes, which is lost, then becomes this marble statue, and then becomes plaster casts, and then becomes, in this case, a digital record. So in terms of telling the story about how these records change through time and change material through time, Laocoon was a fantastic example. And we're looking at the bottom of those 3 bullet points now about this idea that you can take a record, which is now an artifact, and you can use that to open up much, much broader stories. So I'm just going to show you this is a little of the content that we associated with the Laocoon in the immersive system. So a lot of historic photographs from where it was inside the Mackintosh building. There was gaze-activated video content telling the story of the plaster casts consolidation and reconstruction prior to being put back into the Mackintosh building, as we'd hoped. And we were drawing in lots of different types of data for this project. So there was the history of the Laocoon plaster cast and its role in the Mackintosh as a teaching aid, the art historical significance of the Laocoon itself, that rich history, the damage and restoration of this particular plaster cast in this particular event, and there's some self-reference to the position of the digital replica itself. So we're actually talking in the immersive system about the significance of the digital replica, so digital copy. So I'm going to play a little of this. I'm not going to play it all because it's quite long, just to give you a flavour of what we're talking about. Just going to run it forward a little bit to. This is a discussion around the conservation process for the Laocoon plaster cast. Quite a lot of information there, and just up to the.
Hi, Stuart. Just to confirm, there's no audio, shouldn't be playing.
So say that again, sorry.
Audio shouldn't be playing, like there's no audio attached to the video.
Yes, there is audio. Sorry, can you not hear the audio?
No, there's no audio coming
Okay,
through.
that's fine. Well, that's great. Let me tell you what you. Let me tell you what this. I should have made it
Perfect.
clear, actually. First of all, that what we're actually looking at there is a first-person point of view of a fully immersive system. So there's obviously a full VR headset experience where you're surrounded by that. There is a narration. It doesn't matter. In fact, actually, one of the criticisms of this particular immersive was the nature of the narration. So that's fine. That's good. Um, However, the points I'd like to make about it before we go on to think about Unpath, about how this operates as an immersive system, is that it is creative. It draws in all that different content we were talking about there, the art historical story, the story of the conservation, and then the story around digital replication itself. It was all drawn in. But even given that, what we've actually got is a very kind of narrow and specific product. This is about the Laocoon in a building with particular histories that we can wrangle really quite easily. However, there is a lot of material about the Laocoon elsewhere in the world. There's hundreds of other plaster casts in museums. There's lots of other creative responses. There's this fantastic skeletal version of the Laocoon and his sons by Douglas Tyler down there. There's lots of really interesting stories on the Laocoon, where it is, other art schools, other museums, other creative responses, other stories that are really, really distributed globally, in actual fact, around the world. So what we produced doesn't connect into that much broader network that exists out there. And that runs slightly counter to that idea we were talking about of where the digital content stops being a record, becomes an artifact, and then becomes a portal where you're facilitating these connections with a much wider world. Now we come to Unpath'd Waters. So hopefully, why we did what we did in Unpath'd Waters should be more apparent from what I've just described about that progression in digital heritage over the last few years. So the Unpath'd Waters project was a really big project, really exciting project to be part of. It was led by Historic England. Barney Sloan was the PI. It was part of the HRC's Towards the National Collection funding strand. So it was all about gathering together heritage data into a single accessible heritage collection. And Unpath'd Waters was looking very specifically at maritime heritage, maritime data sets. As you can see, there was a lot of people involved in this. There was 4 independent research organizations, 9 universities in total, plus our trusts, Mary Rose Trust, Wessex Nautical Archaeology Society, and partners such as Manx National Heritage. So it was a big project and very ambitious. And there's the work packages. I won't spend too much time in this, but it wasn't all about the Unpath'd Navigator, which is what I'm going to talk about. There was a lot of other work going on. Aggregation and characterization of maritime heritage data. AI and data enhancement was a big part of it. And then there was sub-work packages looking at particular stories around people in the sea, science in the sea. A big focus in one of these sub-projects on Doggerland, lands beneath the sea. And also Sarah Perry and Katrina Foxton, who worked with me on work package 4, the co-design, also ran that work package 5, which is looking at audiences and evaluation. So the work package I'm going to be talking about, had the general title, Designing, Immersing and Connecting. And in essence, what we were doing, we were looking at the Unpath'd project as a project that's aggregating maritime heritage, enhancing it through AI, characterizing it. And we were looking at the possibility of using immersive systems as a way of exploring and navigating that really rich data set. So this sits in opposition to the examples I've already shown you, which are narrow and focused, telling the stories of a place or an object, maybe from different perspectives. This is about trying to use an immersive system, generalizing it to access much broader data sets. And this was the first step of what we might actually be trying to do with this immersive system. Key thing is that, unsurprisingly from what I've just discussed, I was really interested in co-designing this with our particular audiences, and we'll come on to those in a minute. But this idea of making it a portal and accessing all this content live was really foremost in my mind. So I was really interested in that, where the data was being aggregated and stored with the ADS in an RDF triple store, that we could query that directly. There was also, we had access to a whole host of external data, such as notionally the BBC archive, other Unity assets out there, 3D content from other consortium members. So this is really exciting. And I knew that we had some technical issues that we had to deal with. So we maybe don't want to get bogged down in these, but I knew if you were going to generalize an immersive system, you were going to have these technical issues to overcome. Was that about 100,000 records, we had to be able to translate that to the local grid and ideally have it live loading, which is non-trivial. Big problem is content addressing. So the records themselves are they come from national monument records or historic environment records. They're basically text based, but we know there's much richer content out there. There's images of, I'm going to say ships here, but there's a lot more than that in the maritime record. Let's say there's images of ships, ship histories, documents associated with them, potentially 3D models of these ships. So there's lots of really rich content. Is it addressable? Can we actually, if we run a search and want to bring up an image of the ship as well, is there a DOI or a URI that allows that to be addressable? Interesting problem. Same with the content formatting. So let's say that there is a material out there, 3D material that you might want to move into your immersive system. Again, the example would be a ship or a shipwreck. What format is it in? Is it in FBX? Is it in a format that your immersive system software, Unity in this instance, could handle, or is it an OBJ? Does it require reformatting or translation to a new format? Same issue with content scaling. It's like, well, you've got a record of a shipwreck. It's amazing. It's 20 gigabytes. This cannot obviously be loaded live into an immersive system. So how are you managing scaled down versions of that content. Navigation, querying selections, a forever problem in immersive systems, and we'll come on to talk about that a little bit later. And similarly, we had an ambition to be able to port this entire thing to WebGL, so it wouldn't just be an immersive system, it would actually be usable more broadly. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. So, ambitious, already identified technical problems, all of which I think were addressable somewhere or another. I was really interested in co-design. So this co-design is actually this image is like a tidy version of what it's actually like. Co-design is an interesting and important and useful process, but it's problematic. And see if we get problematic in design terms, and see if we can see why, looking back to what I've just outlined as the ambition for the MCAS navigator. So co-design engages intended users of a product or public service in the design activities from the outset. We identify the audiences it wants to reach and so on, brings them on board to help design specifically for their needs. These are the last 2 points are the ones that are really important from my perspective. Is it's an iterative process, meaning that we kind of learn as we go. And it's really important that the researchers don't enter the process with any preconceptions about what we want, and that we must be genuinely interested in what the participants have to say. We must avoid the scenario in co-design where essentially you're paying lip service. You're saying you're doing co-design, you may be interviewing people, having workshops and whatever, but you have this in your mind, and you can't let go of it. In the co-design process, it's really important that you don't have these preconceptions, and that you do respond directly to what your audiences are saying. And in audiences, well, we decided to set ourselves a real challenge. Part of the brief that was given to us by Tank was to look for novel audiences. So these were the audiences after much discussion amongst the work package 4 and the broader team, but particularly Sarah Perry, myself, and Kat Folkston, was we decided to design for these 3 audiences specifically, or go through the co-design process for these 3 audiences specifically. Cross-disciplinary maritime researchers. And this is because I was really keen on this audience, because a lot of work done in immersive systems tends to suggest or is aimed at broad public audiences. It looks like it's a gimmicky kind of thing. It's essentially comes out of the gaming industry, where people are wearing headsets. It's not being used for professional purposes. And it struck us that one of the audiences who might be using this rich maritime data sets would be professional researchers. Could we build a system or could we identify the design elements that would work for that particular audience? We also decided to go, this is beyond a novel audience, but this goes to an audience that is extremely underserved in games and immersive systems, and I would argue actually in digital heritage more broadly. And this is a visually impaired community who, if you're developing systems that are heavily reliant on visual elements and visual cues, and you aren't taking into account the multiple issues of the visually impaired community, then essentially you're excluding them from being able to engage with the content. So that became a really important driver for us. The other audience members we were particularly interested in were people who did not, they're called non-coastal heritage users or non-coastal communities, but essentially we were looking for an audience of people who did not consider themselves associated with maritime heritage. I mean, it all seems a bit random, because if you live in Britain, you're never that far away from the sea. So our entire history is bound up with the sea for transport and trading and all the rest of it. So when we say non-coastal communities, it's a little bit sophistry, to be honest with you, because essentially we were looking for people who weren't interested in the sea. It wasn't that the heritage wasn't relevant to their communities. It was that they weren't making that connection. So I'm going to give you just run through a few slides on the results of the co-design workshops and the design cues that we got from these different audiences and how they felt about different things. And I'll then show you some examples of what that actually looked like in the navigator in the prototype that was built. And then again, I've got another little first person video showing what it was actually like being inside the navigator. So we're co-designing with these three distinct groups is definitely a challenge in terms of practicalities, but also reconciling design input. So it's important to note that in the co-design process, when I mentioned that it can be problematic and offer challenges. One of the challenges is that very rarely in a co-design process will you get a group agreeing entirely about how something should look or behave. There will always be multiple opinions. That's the nature of it. And we'd also set ourselves a kind of a task associated with our ethical position. Sarah Perry worked a lot on a value statement for the whole project, and that was extremely well developed. And we were looking to adhere to the stated values of the project as much as possible. And one of those was basically telling us that when we're designing for the visually impaired community, what we shouldn't be doing is designing something for everybody and then trying to retrofit it for the visually impaired community. What we actually need to do is design something for the visually impaired or visually impaired persons from the beginning. So it's not something that somehow or other works really well for fully sighted people and has been retrofitted for the visually impaired community. It's designed from the visually impaired community from the beginning. And that actually raised a couple of really quite serious and quite interesting challenges for us. Despite what I said about the reconciling design input, it is interesting that the three groups, so the non-coastal communities, the cross-disciplinary maritime researchers, and the visually impaired groups we work with, actually had different focuses. What they were interested in developing in the co-design process. So the non-coastal community were really interested in digital narratives and aesthetics, how something might look and how something might feel. So maybe more akin to the immersive systems I was showing you around CIfA there, for example, or the Digital Laocoon, for example. So where aesthetics and looking for were really, really important. The researchers were really interested in design, interaction, and functionality. What can you do with it? What kind of data can you get? How easy is it to get that data? What are the searching mechanisms and so on? And perhaps unsurprisingly, the visually impaired persons were really interested in the interface and accessibility. They're really interested in whether this immersive system would be usable for them, full stop. And they gave us amazing feedback actually on usability issues. Which I'm not going to go through here. There is a full report on the co-design process and technical development. I'll give you a link at the end towards that for people should people wish to read up in a bit more depth on all the design cues that we got from our different groups. But I think it's really important to make this point that which is obvious, is that visual impairment is a broad spectrum of issues. There's all kinds of different visual impairments, and frequently they need a different type of response, or different type of visual response. So there's no homogeneity in this group, either of what they're interested in, actually, but there's no homogeneity in particular around the nature of their impairment and how you have to respond to this. So what became obvious very early on in designing this was that they were really interested in flexible settings. So what they were interested in was that at the very beginning of the process, you can change color schemes, contrast schemes, issues, things called vignette and bloom, which are to do with color and contrast, text size, text color, switching on sound effects, and audio and voiceovers and so on are really interested in that. And that actually turns out to be a major design challenge for us, because the controls for those do not exist natively once you're actually in world in Unity. You can set these things before you go into the world, but we actually had to build the controls that allowed those selections to be made actually when you're in world. And it's also worth pointing out that that this issue around settings and tailability primarily came from the visually impaired groups, but actually also came from a number of people in the non-coastal community group as well. That was having some process by which you can tailor things to your own preferences came through very strongly from both those groups. Yeah, so I've already mentioned, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself there. So both also already mentioned that diversity of impairments, which is a key concern. Something which I wasn't actually expecting, and something might be quite useful for us all to think about going forward, depending on how what kind of systems we're working on in the future, is that they were really interested in speech to text. So they were really interested in being able to hover over buttons and controllers and have those spoken to. They were absolutely adamant that they do not like AI generated or robotic voices. In fact, they really, I mean, this is kind of unspoken, but it was almost offensive to them that this was being done using kind of clunky speech to text. And so we spent quite a long time using a voice artist, essentially, not just in the storytelling elements of the navigator, but in all the controls. I mean, there's basically hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of snippets and elements of audio for those hoverovers that were all done individually rather than speech to text. Unity now has native speech to text, text to speech, actually. Other way around. Unity now has that built in, but bear in mind what our users were telling us about this. There was lots of other interesting design components. For example, I thought initially that gesture recognition would be favoured by most of our audiences. Turns out not to be the case. They actually much preferred controllers. In fact, they actually preferred one. Given that the photograph shows people using two controllers, they actually preferred one controller. Yeah, that's what they asked for, and that again made how we interact in a complex fashion to run queries. That makes that slightly more complicated. They were all in favour of haptic feedback, so hover over cues, little shakes, sound description, sound and audio I've mentioned. Ironically, they were also concerned about text displays overwhelming the virtual environment with too much text. So all these things had to be balanced out. So without going back to that diagram showing you my ambition and how that didn't survive the co-design process, it's also worth pointing out that even some of the technical challenges we addressed weren't resolvable in this iteration of Unpath. For example, we could not search the linked data store, the RDF, the Ariadne, which is stored at the Archaeology Data Service. Because of latency, we couldn't actually access that directly. So we had to snapshot that data. I was really interested in it if we couldn't have DOIs resolving to really rich content, as I was mentioning, like video, audio, documents, then we could perhaps resolve to a web page for each individual record, and they would have links out to that. Well, as it happens, currently you can get web viewers inside Unity, but the way they work is that they actually preload. So if your base is 100,000 records and half of those have got web pages, then it simply becomes impractical to preload those all that content. Where we did have rich content, and we decided to take an approach a bit like we did with the Digital Laocoon, where we were telling very specific stories. We were called these curated voyages because essentially we are curating all the content. We're allowing people to be guided through those. In design terms, it wasn't so problematic. In terms of content, it was because we couldn't co-design that content with our audience groups because we were in a chicken and egg scenario. They can't curate the content because they can't find what content is available, and there's a limit to how much time and effort I think it is reasonable for us to expect co-design participants who, for clarity, they were actually being paid for their time, so they weren't being exploited. Again, this is part of the value statement that the whole project, or our kind of core values, how that worked. We were making sure that we were dealing equitably with the co-design participants. So the final point I'd like to make about that, and before I show you some examples of it, and we'll wrap up in time for some questions, hopefully, is that in evaluation, what turned out to be really successful, or most successful, was a series of soundscapes, which were done by our master's course here at the GSA. A number of students produced really elaborate soundscapes around particular maritime themes, and they were almost entirely non-contextual. They weren't drawing on any other information that was being aggregated through the Unpath'd Navigator. They were kind of standalone. They were super popular with the particularly with the visually impaired groups. So, this is just a little reminder about the evaluation process. So there was a whole work package, stage 5 evaluation. The design avenue that we went down, working with visually impaired people and designing around their needs, particularly around settings, meant that if that context wasn't given to a broader audience, broader audiences were finding themselves thinking, why does this look the way it looks, given that they know virtual reality games, for example, virtual reality headsets can be very, very richly textured and highly detailed. This is not what our visually impaired audiences were looking for. And consequently, I think in the evaluation process, we needed to think about managing audience expectations and making them or making it clear to all the users what the design process was. So here's some screenshots just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So this is part of the settings. So these settings pop up immediately. You start working in the system because there was an identified problem with the visual impaired persons. Is that they say, oh, sometimes settings will exist that allow you to make these changes, but without having the changes being made, how do you find where those settings are? So again, it's a kind of chicken and egg scenario. This is our search room where everything was kind of broken down thematically. You could teleport around this space. The geographical component essentially was based on the shipping forecast areas. So you could navigate to the shipping forecast map, and as you kind of scanned around it, it would tell you what shipping forecast area you were going to, and you could select. That's the granularity that we can do with a single controller, I'm afraid. So once you've made your selections, for example, there's notional selection here of local shipping forecast area and any records tagged as containing slavery. So there you are. Then we pop back out to the results room. So basically the results room has everything that's tagged for or that falls within that local area and has a mention of slavery, and we're using the Z coordinate as the temporal dimension. So basically lower down is older, higher up is more modern. As you can see in this particular example, everything's kind of falling in that early modern period, really. And you'll also notice that we got problems with naming conventions. So we were going straight from the aggregated field name from all these different record sets that we were dealing with. And you can see we've got some that are null there, for example. Hornbabs, some of these are artifacts. There's one down there, citizens. So that's actually in the record name itself. It starts with the project that the record was generated from. This is a little example of the curated pathways, but I think I'll go on now because I'm running out of time. If we're going to have questions, I'll just run on to give you a sense of what this looked like and how high contrast and the lack of detail that we've got in this in comparison to the other ones I was showing you.
And just to double check, should we be expecting
No,
sound?
there's no audio in this. You're
Okay,
pleased to know.
No, just your lovely voice.
Yep. So as you can see, this goes on. So these are the vignettes. So there's quite a range of possible settings that were asked for by the visually impaired groups. So on that goes. This is in the search room. In essence, as you can see, we're using pop-outs from objects. I mean, their high contrast should be fairly obvious. Submarines, warships, planes, so on. So once these are actually selected, I'll just do this. So here we're selecting submarine, running the query. You can select individual ones, and if the text goes over that that descriptive text goes over that box, that's all scrollable. Okay, I'm going to stop this, and I'm happy to take any questions that